To paraphrase Alex DeLarge from A Clockwork Orange, the world doesn't seem really real until you see it up there on the screen. And that's what documentary film does. It shatters all of the dreams and the fantasies and the myth-making and narrative film and shows us the real world, or at least it purports to. I decided to make this list of my favorite documentaries, partially because I really want other people to see them, and partially because I wanted to see what I would come up with. I wanted to know what I would think are the best. I spend a lot of time watching documentaries, and I find it much easier to get into nonfiction than to a fictional program for some reason. I can just sit there and watch it and just eat them like popcorn, whereas a fictional work, it just seems so much more effort and time would have to be put into it to sort of get into the world and know what it's about and care about it, whereas reality it's very easy to care about. I'm going to show 10 films here that I think are my absolute favorite documentaries, the ones I've watched multiple times, the ones I've really gotten something out of, and the ones that I think other people really ought to see. And I'm going to show television and film. I'm going to show foreign and American films here. And I'm only going to abide by one rule, which is that I'm not going to have more than one documentary from the same director. But other than that, I'm just going to show whatever I like. I'm not doing this grading them 10 to 1. These are just going alphabetically about what my favorites are. So here you go. These are my absolute favorite documentary films and the ones I want everybody else in the world to see. Number 1, American Movie, directed by Chris Smith and released in 1999. We usually think of documentaries as being very, very serious sort of entertainment. It's non-fiction. It's something that's supposed to have a message and a meaning about the world, not the frivolity and silliness of a comedy, and yet American Movie is one of the funniest movies ever made. It is relentlessly hilarious. It is funny over and over and over again, and can be watched over and over again. I mean, there are a lot of good jokes out there that you can laugh at, but very few of them you can laugh at over and over again, no matter how many times you hear them. And that happens all the time in American Movie. I've seen this movie many times. It is one of the most quotable movies ever made, and it is guaranteed to make you laugh if you watch it, no matter who you are. The story follows, in the late 90s, a man named Mark Borchardt from Wisconsin in the United States. And he has a dream. It is a dream to make a no-budget horror movie called Coven, or Coven, as they ridiculously pronounce it. And it's going to be filmed in black and white and about a group of cultists, and he's going to make this movie entirely on his own and sell it and maybe make a fortune or maybe get known in Hollywood or something like that. And it records the trials and travails Mark goes through with his family and his friends and his co-movie makers and everyone he meets in the world, and shows you his life as he tries to produce his dream project of Coven. And throughout this, we get a portrait of a man that is not perfect. He drinks heavily. He's sometimes quite stupid. He's often irritating and annoying to friends and family members alike. And he's just not a perfect guy, and yet you really come away from this loving him. At least I do, because I want to be a filmmaker someday. So the idea of having that dream is one that's intimately close to my heart, to be a director as he wants to be. And he has the drive to go out there and actually make this movie, which is really, really hard. Until you've actually made a few videos on just on YouTube, you don't know how hard it is to be so bad, how much effort you have to put in to be so mediocre. And he puts in an enormous amount of blood, sweat, and tears to get this, tiny little, I think half an hour long horror movie out on VHS. And he goes out into the woods and gets his mom involved, and his friends are all there, and they're out in the woods in the middle of the winter in Wisconsin, so you know it's cold. And everyone has these ridiculous Wisconsin accents, and hearing Mark exposit about the world and his life and everything around him is really interesting. And despite all of the humor and the ridiculousness as this fool tries to get this movie made, there's a really poignant, sad story there. We get to meet his uncle, I believe, who's this old guy who's given up on life and just doesn't care anymore. And he's this amazing contrast to Mark, who is a foolish person but has a powerful dream, whereas his uncle is a very intelligent, realistic person and yet has no dreams and is suffering and is kind of miserable. And we also get to meet his amazing friend Mike and the struggles he goes through with drugs and alcohol and gambling addiction. And He's just the sweetest, most lovable guy you can meet. And he's just, all of the people in here with their thick Wisconsin accents, it's so ridiculous and so enjoyable. Mark wants to eventually make a movie, which he still has not yet made, called The Northwest or something like that. And it's a dream he has about a movie, an epic film that is going to be about the sort of decay and misery of the industrial classes in Wisconsin and around there, filmed in black and white, of course, and it's about decay. It's about sort of desolation and sadness, and you get to learn so much about his life and his friends, and it's so funny to watch him try to get this movie made, and it's really poignant when he actually eventually does get it made. This is one of the best documentaries I've ever seen. It's one of the greatest comedies I've ever seen. Definitely one of the best comedies in the past 30, 40 years in American cinema. This is highly recommended whether you're interested in filmmaking or not, because it is guaranteed to make you laugh. It's called American Movie from 1999. Check it out.
Here's what I think of the lottery. I think it's like when you play the lottery, sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. But it's better than using drugs or alcohol, because when you use drugs or alcohol, especially drugs, you always lose.
Number 2, Cave of Forgotten Dreams, directed by Werner Herzog in 2010. What did cavemen dream about? How did they see the world? We're never going to know the answer to this question, unfortunately, because, for the hundreds of thousands of years that Homo sapiens have existed, we've only had history exist for a tiny percent of that time. Only the past few thousand years, and even that's spotty and difficult to understand at times. But cavemen, our earliest ancestors from tens or even hundreds of thousands of years ago, left a remarkable record for us to get a little tiny window into what they thought, felt, and believed. And we get to see that in Cave of Forgotten Dreams. Like Civilization, this is a documentary about art, and yet this is a documentary about the earliest art that we know of, art made by our primitive ancestors, cavemen as we used to call them, from a very long time ago in caves in southern France. This is made by Werner Herzog, maybe my favorite director, and it is, he's made a ton of great documentaries, but I think this might be the best. He takes you inside the caves in France where these ancient peoples, these cavemen, created these incredible works of art, the earliest expressions of what made us different from animals. We do a lot of things that you could say that animals do, except we do them in a more sophisticated form. But creating art is something that human beings exclusively do. We are able to make our dreams and what we think manifest, incarnate in the real world. And we get to imagine throughout this documentary, inside these caves lit by torches, what they would have looked like. And we get to see all of the drawings of people and animals and perhaps rituals and why they painted a handprint on the wall. Why did they do all of this? It's a mystery and we never get an answer. It just gives you something to ponder forever. It's a great documentary because you really just get to thinking, who were these people? What did they think? What was their reality like? How did they see the world? How did they imagine themselves and gods and animals and nature and the world around them? What did they think? And we're never going to get to know, but we do get the tiniest little pinhole into the truly ancient past, the prehistoric past, about what these people were like. And it's an incredible documentary. You have to see it, and you can watch it multiple times because the spell of wonder that it casts over you and what you think is unlike anything I've ever seen. It is a truly incredible documentary. I've been interested in paleoanthropology for a long time, since I was a kid. But even if you're not interested in our primitive ancestors, this is still an important work. Check it out. It's absolutely incredible. You won't be disappointed.
This cave had been perfectly sealed for tens of thousands of years, contained by far the oldest paintings ever discovered. These images are memories of long-forgotten dreams. Will we ever be able to understand the vision of the artists across such an abyss of time?
Number 3, Century of the Self, directed by Adam Curtis, 2002. Adam Curtis. If I hadn't imposed that rule about only including one documentary per director, then this list would just be filled with Adam Curtis documentaries, because he's an absolutely extraordinary documentary filmmaker. He works on making films that are sort of historical, but also socio-political, with his own interpretations of events based on another side to history that we don't really get to hear about, sort of the psychological and emotional backdrop that gave us the political changes that we saw. Now, we all know, in general, the political changes over the past century and historical events around them, but he tries to show us what led us to the mode of thinking that brought about those events or was used to justify the feelings of the time. In his seminal work made in 2002 for the BBC, something that he's gone back to in future documentaries that he's done in some ways, is The Century of the Self, which shows that selfishness and what they call inner direction was really what shaped the latter half of the 20th century. The world was really horrified by the nightmarish violence brought about when the clash of empires took place during the First World War, and then the hideous clash of ideologies which took place during the Second World War. And in The Century of the Self, he chronicles this amazing journey, starting with Sigmund Freud and one of Freud's relatives who invented the term public relations, a man named Bernays, and how they created public perception politics, and the idea of, in the age of mass democracies, when people in the latter part of the 19th century, suddenly there was universal manhood suffrage, and then in the early 20th century, universal suffrage, including women, how the elites could guide most people in what they believed, thought, and how they were going to act. And he ties that in with a very strange story about how people went in the first half of the 20th century from being very outer-directed, being interested in community, nation, race, religion, and all of these things that take place in demographic groups outside of the self, to the latter half of the 20th century, from the boomer generation onward, where people are going to be inner-focused. And that's not really something you hear about too often. His documentaries are also a really rich and exciting audio-visual experience. He takes an extraordinary wealth of footage from the BBC archives and elsewhere and really cuts and pastes them into this magnificent feast for the eyes that it's really wonderful just to sit and watch. And his music choices, with this interesting arrangement of popular music at different points, is really, really well done. It's not just the content. It's not just like a radio program you'd listen to, as some documentaries kind of turn into. You really want to look and watch this one. He does an incredible job showing the changes in the Anglophone world, especially in the United States and the United Kingdom since the 80s, may have been the result of people sort of gearing society in favor of these inner-directed people who are mostly interested in their own personal advancement, as opposed to identifying as broader measures of society in terms of class and other things. So it is an incredible documentary. Even if you're not really interested in history, it doesn't come across as like a history documentary. It's its own weird little thing. And it is very, very interesting, and it's something you can watch over and over again and learn all kinds of new and exciting things, and it'll lead you into interesting areas to explore yourself and looking into afterwards, reading interesting books, hearing about people you may never have heard of before. It's a wonderful documentary. A lot of his documentaries are extraordinary, but this is the one that is the absolute best, in my opinion, and forms the foundation for his other work. Highly recommend it. You check this out.
He showed American corporations for the first time how they could make people want things they didn't need by linking mass-produced goods to their unconscious desires. By satisfying people's inner selfish desires, one made them happy and thus docile. It was the start of the all-consuming self, which has come to dominate our world today.
Number 4, Civilization, presented by Kenneth Clark, developed by David Attenborough, 1969. Civilization is a magisterial 13-part series released in 1969 by Kenneth Clark, or K. Clark for the BBC. And he is an art historian that looks back on 1,500 years of European art to try to come up with a magnificent summation of everything that modern European man has achieved. It was made at the height of the countercultural movement of the late 60s and early 70s, when an entire generation, the baby boomer generation, turned against the history of their ancestors and began to attack and degrade and denigrate their forefathers and everything they've achieved. And it was very fashionable for many years, as it is right now, to hate and mock everything going on in European civilization, even because it's associated exclusively with negativity. But Clarke comes up with an incredible defense of everything that European civilization has achieved and shows the magnificence, the glory, the grandeur of all of the painting and sculpture, and how after it was destroyed at the end of the Roman era, it dragged itself up out of the muck and created everything that we know and love about modernity. And you don't necessarily have to agree or disagree with his politics. I don't agree with everything he says either. But he does an amazing job selling all of the incredible expressions of the human soul that make Western civilization something worthwhile, something interesting, and something that should be studied and revered, although of course it does have its problems. Throughout his history of art, he weaves in and out the history of the world at the time, from the Renaissance, the Middle Ages, the Enlightenment, and shows a parallel between increasing interest and skill at artistic representation and increasing ability to be civilized and drag themselves out of the barbarism plaguing everyone in the Dark Ages in Europe. It's something to really sink your teeth into. This is 13 hours of documentary, and it really is worthwhile to watch everything and see everything he has to say about the political world and the strife and the wars people were going through, and how throughout 1,500 years of history, people were always willing to look to some sort of representation of themselves, their mind, their soul, their identity as a human being, to lift themselves up out of that. And he really shows civilization and what that term means at a time when the barbarous anarchy going on at the time was so fashionable. He really lauds civilization, and honestly, his defense of civilization in this work really trumps and defeats a lot of the shabby and poorly thought out arguments against Western society from that era. It's a truly awe-inspiring work, and it is highly recommended to anyone, even if you have no interest in art history. I really don't have much of an interest in art history, to be honest, and yet I was still fascinated by this work and how he managed to tie everything that was going on over centuries into the history of art, and how it kept getting better and better and more civilized over time as we moved away from violence and war and horror and made truly great strides for the human soul. Now, admittedly, it really doesn't cover the 20th century that much, and Kay Clarke really doesn't seem that interested or that impressed with the 20th century, so that isn't really on there. But aside from that, this is an incredible introduction to art and society and Western culture in general, and you really have to check it out just once in your life to experience the history of the human soul made manifest through sculpture and painting.
The golden moment was almost over. But while it lasted, man achieved a stature that he's hardly ever achieved before or since, because to the humanist virtues of intelligence was added the quality of heroic will. For a few years it seemed that there was nothing which the human mind couldn't master and harmonize.
Number 5. Cosmos, presented by Carl Sagan, 1980. The documentary series Cosmos is, I think, a great companion piece to civilization. It also traces hundreds and hundreds of years of history, except it shows it through the lens of science rather than art. It goes all the way back to the ancient world and shows mankind's attempts to understand its surroundings and figure out what was going on in the world, and shows the development of wonderful scientific thoughts and ideas, especially from the Renaissance on upward, about coming up with a non-religious love of the world and sort of transferring the majesty and the grandeur and the gloriousness of the religious sensibility and understanding of the universe, and explaining that you don't need these ideas to be religious. They can be found in science, in the real definable world. It's already a magnificent cosmos around us. We don't really need to see anything any differently than through science. It's still this incredible, there's still the amazement that you can find looking at the world through that scientific lens. And it shows all sorts of different developments, talking about evolution and astronomy and biology and all kinds of different things, with a special focus on physics and the universe all around us. And it's hosted in its original form by Carl Sagan, a man with a magnificent voice that just sounds so wonderfully slow and calming and reassuring. It's just so, it's beautiful to listen to his voice. It's also done with the music of Vangelis, who did the Blade Runner soundtrack, which is one of my favorite movie scores of all time. The Cosmos soundtrack is also incredible and has... Cosmos was recently remade a few years ago with Neil deGrasse Tyson, the sort of most famous popular scientist around nowadays. And that version is fine. I've only seen a couple of episodes of it here and there, and, you know, it's okay, but he does a good job, but he just doesn't have the charisma I feel that Carl Sagan has. And most importantly, the music in the original Cosmos, which is done by Vangelis, is just so perfect. And I really just, I mean, the new one is fine. If you love that one, that's great, but the original is the one for me. And it's such an incredible, joyous, happy kind of experience to learn about all of these amazing individuals and astronomers and biologists and the people that were really studying what makes the world and the universe exist. Why is it here? What is going on in it? And, you know, you really get to love these stories, even if you dislike science. And I want to make it clear, I hate science as a subject. I don't like it. I virtually never read about it. I have almost no interest in it, except in this documentary. It made me love it. So even if you have no interest in science, I highly recommend this documentary, because it'll take you on a remarkable journey through the entire galaxy, and we can learn so much about the wonder and the mystery of the universe. It is just, it's breathtaking. It almost feels like a religious experience watching all this. I highly recommend you check this out, either the old version with Sagan or the new version with Neil deGrasse Tyson, which is admittedly far more advanced and correct in terms of current scientific theory, so that's what you want to go for if you want more accurate scientific information. But the original I still love, and you still get that sense of traveling through time and examining all these important phases in human scientific development in either one of the documentaries. They're incredible.
That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there, on a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam.
Number 6, Crumb, directed by Terry Zwigoff, 1994. Back in the 1960s, the generation that had grown up just after the Second World War, the baby boomer generation, were undergoing a gigantic change that would revolutionize American society. They were creating what was known as the counterculture, where they attacked all of the ideas and thoughts and beliefs and attitudes that their parents' generation had, and changed things and created their own identity. And one of the most interesting aspects of that is underground comics created during that time period, where people who had been raised on the standard superhero-style comics of the 1940s and 50s suddenly decided to use that medium to advance their own thoughts and beliefs about the world. And these comics were called underground comics because they really reflected the underground counterculture that was opposed to a lot of American society at that time period. And they were filled with violence and sexual situations and all the kinds of things that obviously they could not include in comic books at that time. And the most famous person that came out of this world is Robert Crumb. He is an amazing cartoonist, and this documentary from 1994 may be my favorite documentary of all time. It showcases this absolutely incredible artist and takes a very personal, very sympathetic, and fascinating look into his world. It asks the question that is unanswerable. Why is this guy able to do this? Whether that artistic endeavor is playing an instrument, or becoming a director, or being an actor, or drawing a comic book, we never really know exactly what it is that makes him capable of this amazing, just extraordinary talent. We learn that R. Crumb had a very straight-laced childhood. He was incredibly shy and nerdy as a kid, and eventually during the counterculture days he dropped acid, went out to San Francisco, and really turned on to everything that was going on then. Although he still sort of felt like an outcast and a nerd, he was still interested in old-fashioned music from the teens, 20s, and 30s, not the rock music of the time, and felt sort of out of place with the hippies. He was sort of someone from a past generation. Even though he attacked and tried to destroy everything, ultimately, from his parents' generation with his attitudes towards sex and life and religion and politics, he was actually very much emotionally still at home in the world, oddly enough, that his parents and grandparents inhabited in the pre-World War II era, which he kind of idolizes. And we get to see his family and his friends, and they talk about him and their experiences with him. Apparently they had a brutal father when they were growing up, and he and his mother fought constantly, and a lot of his siblings were very strange. There's a moment we actually get to see one of his siblings named Charles Crumb, and his life is just such a sad story. It's really hard to watch in some ways. But we really get a feeling that art was the transformative event in his life, when he learned that he could draw, when he could express himself in that way. He avoided the severe mental problems and trauma that a lot of the rest of his family experienced, and he was able to expand out on his own and create this amazing world. He became the center of the counterculture in the 60s, even though he felt so apart from it. It became a very important cultural icon of the time. We look at him in the early 90s as he's preparing to leave America, which he really doesn't like, and has grown to strongly, passionately hate a lot of things about modern American society and culture, and he's moving away to France at that time. We spend a lot of time, of course, looking at his art, and I really think that Crumb is not just a cartoonist. He really is one of the great American artists of the latter half of the 20th century. His drawing style is absolutely brilliant. It is so idiosyncratically his. You can tell that he made it. And he draws just a magnificent stream of consciousness of his life and his ideas, and everything just spills out onto the paper into this sort of absurdist collection of weird old-timey cartoons mixed with very realistic, well-done images of blues or jazz artists. You never quite know what you're going to see. We also get a look into the sexual and romantic life of Crumb, which excited a lot of controversy from people. And they have the editor of the ultra-left-wing Mother Drones magazine, the editor at the time in the mid-90s. And she comes out and attacks his work and says that it's just pornography and she doesn't like it and it's inappropriate. But they also have an art critic come out and defend him. And I think that it really comes out looking in Crumb's favor, that he's just getting out everything about himself onto the page there, whether it's violent or sexual, or he just has to get it out there. And it's an amazing journey of artistry and 20th century American life, with amazing music from the blues and jazz of the 1920s and 30s. You also get an amazing window into some very real people, some people that don't feel in any way artificial. They don't seem to be acting as if they care that the camera is there. You especially nowadays get the feeling when someone's on camera that they've almost rehearsed or trained for that fact since childhood, because we live in this overexposed, very camera and movie-filled world where everyone could be filmed at any time. The people from Crumb to his family, to his friends, to his former wives or lovers, they really give you an authentic sense of being real, down-to-earth American people. And I really just love hearing their stories and trying to puzzle out how this guy was able to make this amazing stuff. It is endlessly interesting. You can go and watch this family and hear about his past and see his art over and over and over again. I'm never going to get tired of this documentary. I've seen it many, many times in my life. I absolutely love it, and even if you're not interested in this particular subject, I highly recommend that you check this out, because it is one of the great documentary experiences in American history.
Somebody told me he used to live with the Grateful Dead. I never had anything to do with those guys. I hated that music. When went to a couple of those rock concerts and just fell asleep. It was kind of completely boring, like psychedelic music. When I was about 5 or 6, I was sexually attracted to Bugs Bunny, and I cut out this Bugs Bunny off the cover of a comic book and carried it around with me.
Number 7, Russia's War, Blood Upon the Snow, an Anglo-Russian co-production for TV from 1997. The Second World War is the bloodiest conflict ever fought by human beings. And even though there were atrocities and horrors committed in every front, the absolute worst of them all, the area where human society really reached a degradation it hadn't known since pre-medieval times even, was on the Eastern Front between Nazi Germany and its allies and the Soviet Union. It was there that tens of millions of people, around 10 million Soviet soldiers at least, millions of German soldiers and their allies, and perhaps 20 to 25 million Soviet civilians, and that's excluding the Jewish population, died horribly in this titanic clash of totalitarian ideologies. Russia's War, Blood on the Snow, is a magnificent historical work and the best history documentary I've ever seen. It is a 10-hour process to go through this, and it is very grim and very bloody. But it does an incredible job of setting everything up. The war doesn't actually begin until the 3rd episode, evocatively titled The Goths Ride East. And the first 2 episodes show the political beginning, the darkness, the clouds of darkness that hovered over Europe, with the twin horrors of fascism and communism were tearing into their own people. And it shows the rise of Hitler and Stalin in the 20s and 30s, and how these two men, these two individuals, rose to such a level of power. They were able to lead their respective peoples into a nightmarish conflagration based on fraud, based on myth, they say at one point. It does an incredible job in this series excoriating both fascism and communism. It was released in 1995, a unique period of 10 years in Russia's history, between the fall of the Soviet Empire and the rise of Putin, when there was total freedom to attack and denigrate the Soviet past, and it really tears in to Stalin again and again and again, and how horrible he was, how violent he was, how cruel he was. It also puts paid to a lot of the terrible myths that people have nowadays, where they fantasize that somehow Stalin prevented the world from being taken over by Hitler. And in reality, again and again and again, they show how hideous and awful and vicious he was to his own people, unnecessarily brutalizing them to the point where he severely weakened the Soviet Union and made it far less easy to defend, and also mysteriously trusted the worst and least trustworthy person who's ever lived in order to increase the prestige of his own Soviet empire. He truly was, as they say in this, the greatest traitor in Russian history for all of the help he provided to the Germans just before their invasion. And you really get a feeling of the terror and patheticness of the Soviet regime when they realize that all this time the Nazis have duped them next on the chopping block for Germany's empire. The series takes you through all of the great moments of the war, from the shattering, nightmarish catastrophe of Operation Barbarossa, when it looked like the entire Soviet Union, in the opinion of the United States, could be swallowed up within 3 weeks, towards the horror of Leningrad, which the Germans callously decided to starve out, and the horror stories of the people resorting to cannibalism inside, to the heroism at play from the Soviets at Stalingrad, which turned the tide of the war, towards Operation Bagration, which led the Russians finally to take the offensive and begin pushing the Germans all the way back into Germany, and eventually the terrible climactic battle in Berlin itself, where remaining German fanatics had holed themselves up inside the capital city and were bitterly fighting street for street. It is an incredible moment, and it shows, even if you have no interest in history, it shows one of the most important events in all of human existence, and certainly the most important event of the past century. I love watching all of the individual horror stories that the Soviets go through, and we get to see all of the misery and despair and the atrocities of all kinds throughout this journey, and it really is wearying, and somehow you can't look away, because it's horror. It is human nightmare that is worse than any horror movie ever made. It is an incredible experience. I highly recommend that you check this out. The archival footage they show, intercut with the various Russians talking in present day, is incredible. It's beautifully done. The soundtrack is extraordinary. Everything about this is magnificent. And it's just a relentless 10-hour history of suffering. The narrator of this is perfect. I can get very persnickety about the narrators in documentaries. And if you have a bad narrator, that can really annoy me. But this guy, he is the best narrator I've ever heard for any historical documentary. He is perfect. I love this guy. And the way this is written is done in such a beautifully crisp and swift way. There is never, ever any idle time. This will keep you engaged every single second that it's on screen. Unlike most documentaries, even ones that I like that sort of drag and slow down at points, the breathlessness that the narrator has to go into describing, 10 to 20 years of history between these two nations is incredible. And he always keeps you engaged with some sort of, the never-ending cycle of horror. And it doesn't shy away from the fact that many of the Soviet peoples that were liberated from the Germans were then re-enslaved by the Soviets afterwards. It's better off than being under the Germans, but still pretty terrible. And hearing about all the personalities, of course, in the German and the Russian side, but especially they go deep into the Russian side, because this is co-produced by the Russians themselves. And there were a lot of Russian scholars there who especially had access to a lot of materials that they may even not have access to today, because they might be locked away in the more tyrannical government of Putin. And they go into all of the terrible things that happen to these people. They say at one point that it was another element of suffering in Russia's history of suffering. If you're a history fan, you have to see this, and even if you're not, it's highly recommended to watch at least a few of the episodes and learn a little bit about the most terrifying and horrible moments in the 20th century life.
Stalin will bind in a new serfdom a vast nation of innocent men, women, and children to achieve for himself the most absolute form of power ever achieved. And incredibly, within this long drawn-out internal war, alongside it, these same Soviet people will be called upon to fight back in another war at a cost of another 25 million people against another dictator, Adolf Hitler.
Number 8. The Silk Road, produced by Japanese NHK, 1980. For a very long time, I've been fascinated with Inner Asia, Central Asia. That's the Stan countries, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and also Western China, the Xinjiang or Xinjiang, however you pronounce it, province, and Tibet, and parts of the expanse of Eastern Russia. That whole area of the world has always fascinated me. And they made a beautiful documentary about that world, released in 1980, called The Silk Road. This was made by the NHK, the Japanese National Television Network, and they started filming this in 1972, and it almost took them 10 years in order to complete this, as they traveled all across China and Central Asia and got all of these amazing, beautiful shots of the plains and the steppe and the desert, and they talked to local people, and they went to these magnificent hidden caves, the Dunhuang caves in western China, where there are all these magnificent preserved Buddha statues from China's medieval past, and you just get this sweeping, epic journey over many, many episodes, and they just present this magnificent journey showing you all of the ins and outs and the thousands of years of history around one of the greatest arteries of trade, the Silk Road between China, the Middle East, and eventually Europe that has ever existed. It is filmed beautifully. There are so many shots in this that are amongst the most incredible and amazing things I've ever seen put to film. It is so beautiful just to watch this documentary and see all the peoples and hear all the history. And for a guy that loves history and especially archaeology like myself, seeing them digging up all of these interesting things and seeing all of these remote ruined places from the distant past is absolutely enchanting. The music for it was done by famed Japanese electronic artist Kitaro, and I absolutely love it. I think it has a very old-school 70s electronic vibe to it. These sweeping, gorgeous soundscapes that you can just dive into like an ocean of electronic noise, and they are just beautiful. They are absolutely... I listened to them just outside of the documentary, but combined with the pictures of the steppe and nature and people and the landscape, it is absolutely gorgeous. You can really imagine China during the Tang Dynasty in the 600s and 700s in this amazing quest to go from east to west, the famous Journey of the West that has been done over and over again in so many East Asian films and anime and television shows, and bringing the Buddhist scriptures from India back to China and this amazing quest that you get to go on. And it really left me with this deep, impactful love of Central Asia, its people, its culture, and everything about it. It's just an incredible documentary. It is beautiful to watch, beautiful to listen to. If you have any interest at all in medieval history or Chinese history or anything like that, I highly recommend checking this out. If you're not into those things, you may not enjoy it. But if you are, just have an inkling of interest, it is stunning and one of the greatest documentaries that I've ever seen.
Take a journey on the Silk Road, Marco Polo's ancient route to China. Produced at a cost of $50 million and requiring over 10 years to produce, the Silk Road video collection is comprised of separate adventures linking ancient and modern-day Asia. With the entrancing music of Kitaro as a backdrop, each of the episodes in the collection focuses on the history, art, and culture of one of the world's most inaccessible regions.
Number 9. The Sorrow and the Pity, directed by Marcel Ophol, 1969. The Sorrow and the Pity, a film made famous to American audiences because it was featured briefly in Annie Hall, the Woody Allen film from 1977. This is a magnificent documentary from France in the 1960s, a very long documentary, mind you. It's not recommended, I don't think, in watching it all in one sitting, about the occupation of France during the Second World War. In 1939 and 40, France was still considered by many people, and had for decades since the end of the First War, to be the country with the strongest military in the entire world, which seems quite a bit far away from the France of nowadays. For a variety of reasons which have been argued about since that time period, France lost the war in a single month. Now, some people think it was because of an inevitable German attack that was a sneak attack that was very difficult to avoid. Other people think that it was really a loss of willpower from the French. Whatever the cause of the loss, it led to the tragic occupation of one of the great nations of the world by one of the most savage group of barbarians the world has ever seen. And we get to see the life of ordinary people, a group of communists, a group of people in hiding, a group of resistance fighters, and all sorts of people trying to, in their own way, to either live with and resist or accommodate themselves to the new regime. And there are so many personal stories. It's an entire nation of little tragedies. Every horrible thing that could possibly happen is going on in this documentary under German occupation. And it's fascinating to sit here and watch all of these amazing people and the lives that they're going through, and hear from the politicians about what they tried to do and how shocked they were when they lost, and seeing some English politicians talk about what they were trying to do to help the French at that time period and the nightmare that so many people went through. And it's really a transgressive work from the time period that showcased how much collaboration and violence against France's own people by other French people there was who were sympathetic to the Germans during that time. and really helped the French counterculture that sort of attacked their parents' generation as being too lenient and too nice towards the Germans, as some of them thought, and tried to destroy a lot of the romantic myths about the French resistance. And yet, even with all of that, there's still a lot of amazing stories of truly incredible heroism, of people resisting in impossible odds. This is a movie that is very sad, it is very dark, and sometimes I would say it's not the best looking movie in the world. I don't think the black and white really helps it, to be honest. But it's an amazing, fascinating work and a window into one of the darkest time periods in world history. It is endlessly rewatchable. It's a long one, I have to admit. But I highly recommend this. It's one of the most lauded documentaries ever made. Check it out if you can.
These are the faces today of leaders and followers, of brave men and cowards and men who did nothing. A French aristocrat who joined the Waffen-SS and fought on the Russian front. Another joined the resistance. A German occupation officer argues that the resistance fighters should have worn armbands.
Number 10, Surviving Edged Weapons, directed by Dennis Anderson, 1988. Surviving Edged Weapons. This is probably the silliest of all the documentaries on here, but I had to include it. It's the documentary that has most recently made its way onto my list of my favorite documentaries. I saw it less than a year ago, and I heard about it from a Red Letter Media video where they did a best of the worst and talked about this. And it's a great movie. It's a documentary from the mid-'80s that is essentially like a police training video. And it's meant to train officers on how to recognize and prepare for and resist a criminal attacking you with a blade, with a knife or a sword or some kind of other edged weapon. And it's a weird mixture of like 80s B-movie, documentary, and sort of television news report, maybe, from the late 80s. A significant amount of what's shown in here is staged. It's not really a documentary. It's meant to showcase situations that could possibly happen and show how the police officers should get ready to and react to them. However, they're real-life situations that could theoretically happen to an officer, and they intercut it with horrifying footage of people actually hurt and killed. And sometimes it takes you on this weird journey where at some points it seems almost ridiculous or comic as they stage this knifing that an officer could go through, but then it jarringly cuts away to an actual cadaver from a real-life death of a police officer at the hands of a knife or a sword or a crossbow at one point, I think. And it just seems this weird mixture of ridiculousness and real-life information that you could actually use theoretically to save your life. Like, it shows you that you have to grip the knife with both hands and push it away from you and tear it out of there, squeeze their hand to tear it out of there in order to, best protect yourself. And that you may think that you can do some kind of kung fu move to prevent yourself from being stabbed, but in reality, even someone who's really tough and strong and prepared has almost no time to react when they're being stabbed multiple times by a weapon. And it shows various types of edged weapons, including like a sword at one point, which is really strange. It's an incredible experience. I've watched it several times now. It is so funny and tragic and ridiculous and amazing at the same time. It was also filmed in Milwaukee, so this is the second movie on this list that has those ridiculous Wisconsin kind of accents. And it all just, the mixture of Z-grade action crime movie from the 80s with very serious, dark moments is a really jarring, difficult, and amazing one. And I really recommend that you check this out. It's really good for a laugh. You can learn all kinds of things, and you're just going to enjoy yourself. Watch Surviving Edged Weapons. You may even learn how to survive edged weapons. That's not bad. That's a good thing, right?
Of course, you'll want to preclude or eliminate the possibility of using some lower level of force. You want to be certain of your target identification and try to achieve target isolation so no third parties are needlessly endangered.
Holy shit. Lady, are you okay?
Thank you very much for listening to this excessively long video about all of my favorite documentary films. Please let me know in the comments if you have seen any of these films and what you thought of them, if you thought they definitely shouldn't be on this list, or if you thought I criminally left something out that you think is one of the best documentaries of all time. Please let me know, because I would like to watch it. I'm really hungry for documentaries. I want to see as many as I can. And of course I had to leave out a ton of documentaries that are great, like Grizzly Man, or Marwin Call, or When the Levees Broke, or Dear Zachary, or Paradise Lost, or Z Channel, A Magnificent Obsession. Great documentaries that didn't quite make it onto this list. And tell me if you plan on seeing any of these documentaries based on my recommendation. I'm going to be leaving a couple of my videos here for you to check out, and also please like this video if you liked it, and please subscribe to my channel if you want to see more videos about movies, television, and video games. And yeah, my name is Michael. Have a good night.